At the Munich Security Conference, words really carry weight. In Washington, you could say the wrong thing and probably fix it on Twitter before lunch. But in Munich, if you say the wrong thing to the person controlling France's nuclear arsenal, it'll follow you for your entire career. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez flew to Munich, hoping to prove she was ready for the White House. She had 6 million Instagram followers. She had slogans. She had energy. She had the most recognizable face in the Democratic Party, and she was absolutely certain that charisma alone could command any room on earth. What she didn't have was an answer to the question about Taiwan, and the man sitting across the stage, the son of a Cuban bartender who had negotiated with Vladimir Putin before breakfast and sat across from Xi Jinping before dinner, he knew it before she even opened her mouth. The Bayerischer Hof isn't like Capitol Hill, you know. You won't find any gallery seats for activists to shout from there. No C-SPAN chairins scrolling along the bottom of the screen, and no staffers holding up signs. When you speak at the Munich Security Conference, the people listening are the German Defense Minister, the President of France, the Secretary General of NATO, and 40 other heads of state and foreign ministers who have been doing this longer than most American politicians have even been alive. But they don't applaud because they agree with you. They applaud because you are right. And they can tell the difference between the two faster than any audience in the world. For 40 years, Munich had seen every kind of American politician walk across its stage. Hawks and doves, generals and diplomats, vice presidents and secretaries of state, senators who had memorized every arms treaty since Yalta, and congressmen who couldn't find Ukraine on a map. And it had never seen a 36-year-old congresswoman arrive with an iPhone, an Instagram story filmed on the plane, and the unshakable belief that social media followers were the same thing as foreign policy credentials. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the main hall on Friday morning wearing a tailored charcoal blazer and gold earrings. Her communications director walked 2 steps behind, filming a behind-the-scenes reel. The 3 staffers carried briefing binders they had assembled on the flight from New York. 8 hours of cramming on NATO force structures and European defense spending, the kind of preparation that shows when it's last minute. She waved at a group of young European Parliament members in the second row who had posted about her arrival the night before. She smiled for a photographer from Der Spiegel. She looked in every way like a woman who believed she was about to have the best weekend of her political life. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was already seated when she arrived. He had been in Munich since Thursday, having flown in from a meeting with the Turkish foreign minister in Ankara. He wore a dark navy suit, no tie, which was unusual for him, a small concession to the European informality of the conference. He had a glass of water, a pen, and a single notepad. No staff visible. No entourage, no phones. He had been to Munich 6 times as a senator. This was his 2nd time as Secretary of State. He knew every delegate in the room by name, knew which ones had children in university, knew which ones were worried about Russia, and which ones were worried about China, and which ones were worried about both. He knew these things because knowing them was his job, and he had been doing his job since before the congresswoman from New York had learned what NATO stood for. And the panel was titled, "The Future of American Leadership." The moderator was a veteran German journalist who had been covering transatlantic relations since reunification. 800 people filled the hall. Every major network had cameras. The Europeans had come to see 2 things: whether Rubio would distance himself from Trump's most inflammatory statements, and whether AOC was real, whether the Instagram phenomenon could hold her own on the most serious stage in Western diplomacy. And they would get their answer in about 40 minutes. AOC spoke first. She had requested it, and the moderator had agreed, perhaps sensing that the Congresswoman's energy would make for a more dynamic opening than the Secretary's measured diplomacy. She did not disappoint, at least not initially. "I'm sitting here listening to Secretary Rubio talk about partnership and shared civilization," she began, turning not to Rubio, but to the audience, a performer's instinct, so playing to the crowd rather than engaging the opponent. "And it sounds beautiful. It sounds eloquent. But let's be honest with each other." Her voice rose. The room leaned in. "This man represents a president who tried to buy Greenland, who called NATO obsolete, who abandoned the Kurds, who sent love letters to Kim Jong-un, who tried to blackmail Ukraine, the country we're all here to support, by withholding military aid for personal political favors." She turned to the European delegates, her eyes shining with strong conviction. "And now, Secretary Rubio comes to Munich, offering pretty words about destiny and civilization. Europe deserves more than just a speech. The world deserves more than a sales pitch from an administration that's systematically tearing down every alliance this conference was built to protect." Applause. Strong applause. The European progressives in the room, and there were many of them, stood up. The Social Democrats, the Greens, and several younger MEPs who had all tweeted their excitement about AOC's attendance. The press section typed furiously, "AOC confronts Rubio on world stage." This was the clip she had come to Munich to create, the headline that would launch a 2028 stories. She sat back, satisfied, chest out, chin up. The undeniable look of a woman who had just won. Rubio did not react. He didn't frown. He didn't shake his head. He did something worse. He smiled. Not a smirk, not a political smile. Or instead, it was the small, patient smile of a man who has sat across from foreign ministers threatening war and never flinched, and who now found a congresswoman's rehearsed outrage almost refreshing in its sincerity. The moderator turned to him. "Secretary Rubio, your response." Rubio uncapped his pen, then set it down, looking at AOC with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Thank you, Congresswoman. That was very passionate. I mean that sincerely." He paused. "I have just one question. Yesterday, right here on this stage, you said the United States cannot kidnap a head of state just because the nation is below the equator. You were talking about Venezuela." Another pause. Longer this time. The room truly felt it. "Venezuela is in the northern hemisphere. Caracas sits at 10 degrees north latitude. You were discussing the foreign policy of a nation, and you didn't even know which half of the earth it occupies." He let the sentence land, without raising his voice or adding any commentary, just letting the fact sit there in the middle of the most important security conference in the world, like a stone dropped into still water. This is not Twitter, Congresswoman. In this room. Geography has consequences. The room did not laugh. The room went silent. And in diplomacy, silence is always worse than laughter. Laughter means you're a joke. Silence means you are being reassessed. And reassessment at Munich is truly the beginning of the end. What happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Not the press, not the moderator, and certainly not AOC's staff watching from the overflow room on closed-circuit monitors. They expected Rubio to deliver a speech, to defend the administration, to make his own case, and then just move on. He didn't make a case. He asked questions. This was something the Europeans recognized immediately, even if the Americans in the room didn't. In European diplomacy, the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making accusations. It's the one asking questions, because questions require answers, and answers reveal what you know and what you don't. A speech can be survived. A question with no answer cannot. Congresswoman, you said we need to stand up for democracy around the world. I agree. So let me ask, who is the current president of Honduras? Silence. Who leads the opposition in Venezuela? Not Maduro. The opposition. Maria Corina Machado. AOC said, quickly recovering. Machado. Good. She has been banned from running for office, hunted by state security, and living in hiding for over a year. Have you ever spoken with her? Have you ever mentioned her name in any speech, any press conference, or any Instagram post before today? AOC opened her mouth, then closed it. I have spoken with Machado 5 times in 6 months. The wife of Leopoldo Lopez calls my office every week. These women are fighting for democracy, not on a stage with spotlights, but in darkness, where they could be killed for what they believe. He looked at AOC without hostility, almost with sadness. You talk about democracy as a slogan. They live it as a sentence. The room shifted, but not dramatically. Munich simply doesn't do dramatic shifts. But a murmur moved through the delegates, much like weather moves through a valley. Something had changed. AOC tried to recover. I have consistently spoken out against authoritarian regimes. On Instagram, Rubio said. No, you've spoken out on Instagram. Have you introduced legislation targeting Maduro's financial networks? Have you called for specific sanctions on Venezuelan military commanders? Have you met with Colombian border officials dealing with 3 million Venezuelan refugees? Each question was a door, and behind each door was nothing. No policy, no action, no substance, just posts, just clips, just content. Let me try one more, Rubio said, and his tone wasn't aggressive. It was the tone of a professor who keeps hoping the student will get the next one right. You've spoken passionately about the Green New Deal, about transforming the American economy, about climate justice as foreign policy. Wonderful. Which European country has cut carbon emissions the most over the last decade while still growing its economy? AOC hesitated. Germany has heavily invested in renewable France. Rubio pointed out that through nuclear energy, something the Green New Deal directly opposes, France managed to slash its emissions by 20%, while boosting GDP by 12%, all thanks to the very technology your signature legislation would outlaw. He then glanced at the French delegates seated in the second row. A few of them were nodding in agreement. You've built your entire political brand around climate policy, yet you don't even know which country in this very room has actually tackled the problem you keep discussing. That's not what I'd call leadership, Congresswoman. That's just marketing. But this is policy, Rubio continued, his voice never once losing its conversational tone. Now, let's talk about security. Just yesterday, you were asked the single most crucial question concerning Pacific security. Would America truly defend Taiwan if China were to invade? How he then turned his gaze towards the audience. Everyone in this room heard her answer. It was 30 seconds. It's a really important question. And, I think we need to look at the broader context of, He didn't mock her delivery at all. He didn't imitate her voice either. Instead, he quoted her words flatly, which somehow felt even worse, as that stark repetition left her no room to hide. There are 23 million people living in Taiwan. They have families, children, jobs, and futures. The question of whether America will protect them then. The question that determines whether they'll live freely or under occupation received 30 seconds of and you know. Meanwhile, I answer that very question every week in the Situation Room, complete with maps, generals, and very real consequences. The answer isn't The answer is that 23 million people are counting on us, and we simply do not say AOC leaned into her microphone. Strategic ambiguity has been American policy since before you even took office, Secretary. I was just respecting that framework. Strategic ambiguity actually requires that you truly understand the strategy before you attempt to invoke it. His voice remained perfectly level, diplomatic, yet utterly devastating. So, can you explain the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979? Who signed it into law? What is the United States committed to? AOC's lips parted. Yet, nothing came out. 2 seconds passed. Then, 3 seconds. In a room packed with people who'd dedicated their entire careers to this exact question, those 3 seconds of silence were a stark verdict. President Carter was the one who signed it. Rubio said, just like a teacher stepping in to fill the silence when a student can't answer. It commits the United States to supplying Taiwan with defensive arms and to viewing any forceful action against Taiwan as a matter of grave concern. This isn't classified information, you know, and it's readily available on the State Department website. In fact, it's covered in every introductory textbook about Pacific security. He looked at her, not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with the genuine disappointment of someone who truly wished for a better conversation. You didn't know this, and yet you want to be president. The moderator shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He had been expecting a debate. But this was something entirely different. An examination. And the student was failing. What happened next would be remembered longer than the geography, longer than the Taiwan Silence, longer than any of the policy questions that had systematically revealed what AOC didn't know. They would remember it because it was the moment Marco Rubio stopped being Secretary of State and started being the son of his father. The moderator suggested a brief pause before moving to the next topic. Rubio, however, shook his head. "If I may," he began, "I want to say something that isn't about policy." The room grew quiet. Something in his voice had changed. Not louder, not softer, but closer, more personal. The voice of a man about to speak from the heart. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and I have something in common," he said. "We both tended bar." 800 people immediately recalibrated their expectations. This wasn't in anyone's briefing book. She worked at a taqueria in the Bronx before running for Congress. I know this because her story is famous. Bartender to Congresswoman. The American dream. And it's a real story. It's a good story. I respect it. He paused. My father, though, he tended bar in Miami for 40 years. Not before something bigger. 40 years was the career. He arrived from Cuba with no English, no degree, and no connections. My mother cleaned rooms in hotels. They didn't share their story on Instagram. They didn't write a book about their struggles. They simply went to work. I want to tell you what my father's hands looked like, he continued, because nobody ever asked. They were rough, with cracked knuckles. He polished glasses 8 hours a night, 6 nights a week, and his hands bore the mark of every single hour. When I was 12, Rubio recalled, I asked him why he never complained. He told me, Marco, in Cuba, they took your grandfather's store. They took your uncle's house. They took everything. Here, nobody takes anything. Here, and I work, and I keep what I earn. That is enough. He said the word enough the way other people say miracle, because to him it truly was. My father stood behind that bar every night and smiled at people who never truly saw him. He smiled because he was grateful. Grateful to be free. He was grateful that, in America, Even a man who'd lost everything could work behind a counter and make enough to send his kids to school. For him, that was enough. It wasn't because he lacked ambition. It was because he understood something ambition sometimes makes you miss. The system that let him work that bar and feed his family was a miracle. An imperfect miracle, sure, but a miracle nonetheless. The difference between us, Congresswoman, he continued, isn't about political parties. It's not about being rich or poor. The real difference is this. You worked behind a bar and decided the system was broken, needing to be rebuilt from the ground up. My father, though, tended bar for 40 years and was grateful every single day that such a system even existed. Because in Cuba, there was no bar to work at, no dream to chase, nothing. The room went still, not with the political quiet of a hearing room waiting for the next attack. Instead, it was the human stillness of people hearing something profoundly true. In the second row, the Cuban-born Spanish ambassador took off his glasses and looked up at the ceiling. He knew this story well. In fact, it was his story too. You want to restructure everything, he summarized. My father wanted to protect what we already had. And I am my father's son. To her credit, AOC tried to respond. I respect your family's story, Secretary, she began. I truly do. But I also come from a working-class family myself. My mother cleaned houses. My father passed away when I was just 18. I know what struggle looks like. I know, Rubio said softly, and I am genuinely sorry for that loss. He truly meant it. The room could feel it. This wasn't just a rhetorical move. But loss isn't policy, he continued. Pain isn't expertise. You've turned a personal story into a political brand. And that brand has carried you very far, further than almost anyone expected. But when that brand meets a real question, like, where is Venezuela? Will you defend Taiwan? It breaks because a brand isn't knowledge. And this stage, here, requires knowledge. No one in the room laughed. No one applauded. Rubio had just said the most brutal thing you could possibly say to a politician. That the one thing she truly had, her story, her identity, her rise, simply wasn't enough. Not here. Not for this moment. AOC sat very still. Her communications director, watching on a monitor in the overflow room, slowly placed her phone face down on the table. The panel then continued. It had initially been scheduled for 90 minutes. Yet, they were now well into the second hour, and the moderator showed no signs of stopping, perhaps because he understood, as veteran journalists often do, that he was witnessing something that would later be studied. He then moved the discussion to Ukraine. Rubio spoke first. He spoke for 4 minutes, his words specific, detailed, and operational. He referenced a call he'd had with Zelensky from the previous Tuesday. He cited precise ammunition production numbers, and he named specific weapon systems and their delivery timelines. He spoke the way people do when they've spent every day for a year deeply immersed in a problem, knowing its dimensions like a carpenter knows wood. Congresswoman, what are your thoughts on European defense industrial capacity and its implications for sustained support to Ukraine? AOC straightened up in her seat. See, we absolutely need to stand firmly with Ukraine. Putin's imperialism cannot be allowed to succeed. The United States and Europe must work together to ensure that democracy ultimately prevails. Could you be more specific? The moderator pressed gently. The question was polite, yet lethal. How many 155mm artillery shells does Europe currently produce per month compared to Ukraine's stated need? I don't have the exact figures right in front of me, she replied, Der 40,000, Rubio said quietly, almost as if he were trying to help. The need is 200,000. That leaves a gap of 160,000 rounds per month. Every missing shell means a meter of trench lost. Every lost meter is territory Putin gets to keep. That's arithmetic, Congresswoman, not a slogan. Something in the room shifted then. Not suddenly, but in the way daylight subtly shifts in winter. So gradually, you don't truly notice until the room is quite dark. And the European delegates began to subtly disengage from AOC. Not rudely, no, but far worse than rudely, politely. A Finnish defense minister checked his phone during her answer about NATO burden sharing. Two German parliamentarians leaned closer together and whispered. A French diplomat in the third row opened his briefing book and simply began reading something else. At Munich, these small gestures are never accidents. They are signals. They mean, we've decided you're simply not serious. The moderator then asked about Latin American policy. A Colombian delegate directed his question to Rubio in Spanish, a natural choice at an international conference with simultaneous translation readily available. Rubio answered in Spanish, his response fluent and natural. It was the Miami accent of a man who'd spoken Spanish before he ever spoke English, who'd heard it in his father's stories about Havana, and in his mother's prayers in the kitchen of every house he'd ever lived in. The exchange lasted a full 2 minutes. It was substantive, detailed, the kind of diplomatic Spanish that requires not just fluency, but true policy vocabulary. The moderator, sensing an opportunity, then turned to AOC. Congresswoman, would you like to respond? Perhaps in Spanish, given your district's demographics. My Spanish is more conversational, she replied. She spoke in English. She talked about partnership, to solidarity, and how important it was to involve Latin American communities. Her words were perfectly fine. In fact, her words were always perfectly fine. But the room had just witnessed the Secretary of State doing serious diplomatic work in the language of the hemisphere, and the Congresswoman, representing a district where 46% of people spoke Spanish, couldn't do the same. After the panel, everyone headed to a cocktail reception in the hotel's main salon, the very place where Munich's real business gets done, where simple handshakes morph into agreements and polite chats turn into treaties. Rubio, within minutes, was swarmed. The German foreign minister, the Japanese ambassador, the Polish defense minister, the EU high representative, a never-ending parade of Europe's most influential security figures, each one patiently waiting for just 3 minutes of the secretary's attention. The AOC's staff worked the room as well, desperately trying to set up meetings. The Polish defense minister's reply, "Regrettably, my schedule is full this evening." The Japanese ambassador simply said, "I apologize. I have a meeting with Secretary Rubio." Even a German Social Democrat parliamentarian, someone who should have been a natural ideological ally, someone who agreed with AOC on climate, inequality, and every domestic issue, offered, "Perhaps another time, Congresswoman, and it was a pleasure hearing you speak." That final line was truly the worst. "It was a pleasure hearing you speak" is exactly what you tell someone you'll never ever take seriously. It's the European way of offering warm applause at a student recital. Encouraging, yes, but utterly without consequence. Nobody was rude. Nobody explicitly told her she lost. They simply didn't show up. And in Munich, absence always serves as the final judgment. Through 3 decades of security conferences have established an unwritten rule. The people who truly matter are the ones others genuinely want to speak with. After Friday's panel, the entire diplomatic machinery of the Western world clamored to speak with Rubio. They didn't want to speak with AOC, not out of dislike, but because they had politely, yet irreversibly, concluded that talking to her simply wouldn't make a difference. AOC stood near the bar, an irony she didn't seem to grasp. With 2 staffers and a glass of mineral water, she watched the room revolve around the man she'd come to Munich specifically to challenge. Her communications director was typing something on her phone. Whatever it was, she deleted it twice before finally putting her phone away. Saturday morning marked the conference's second day. A new panel was scheduled: Transatlantic Security Architecture in the Age of Multipolarity. 2 chairs sat on stage, each with a nameplate: Secretary Rubio and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. The moderator began promptly at 9 a.m. "Before we begin," he stated, "I should note that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez sends her regrets. She has been called back to Washington due to scheduling conflicts and will not be joining us this morning." A murmur rippled through the room, followed by a few knowing glances. The European press had been reporting on the previous day's panel since midnight. Rubio exposes AOC's foreign policy gaps was The Guardian's headline, which was quite remarkable since The Guardian doesn't usually publish headlines that favor Republican secretaries of state. Rubio simply glanced at the empty chair, but said nothing about it, not a single word, not a reference, not even a joke. He then simply spent the next hour answering questions. Questions about NATO force posture, Chinese naval expansion in the Pacific, the future of the Iran nuclear framework, and African Union partnerships. Each answer was specific, each was well-sourced, and each was delivered in the calm, measured voice of a man who'd done this work yesterday, would do it again tomorrow, and didn't find any of it remarkable. Halfway through, a young German journalist posed a question. "Secretary Rubio, many expected fireworks between you and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. And do you have any reaction to yesterday's exchange?" Rubio pondered the question for 3 seconds. That diplomatic pause Europeans understand, and Americans often mistake for hesitation. "I don't have fireworks," he stated clearly. "I have work." The Congresswoman is a talented communicator, and I'm sure she'll have a long career in American politics. But this conference is about security. The security of 800 million Europeans and 330 million Americans who rely on the transatlantic alliance. That's what I came here to discuss. And that's what I'm discussing now. He then gestured towards the empty chair. The chair is empty. But the questions are not. Shall we continue? They continued for another 45 minutes, and by the end, that empty chair had become the image, the photograph every European newspaper would print, the metaphor every columnist would grab onto. Rubio, composed and working on one side, and on the other side, nothing at all. A Reuters photographer named Leah Johansson captured the shot that would ultimately define the weekend. She framed it wide. On the left was Rubio, leaning slightly forward, notepad in hand, mid-sentence about Chinese naval expansion in the South China Sea. On the right is the empty chair, its nameplate still clearly reading Ocasio-Cortez. Behind both chairs, there was that blue Munich Security Conference banner. The image really didn't need a caption at all. In fact, it was the caption itself. Deagle ran it across a full page, leaving one word noticeably absent. Lemon featured it right above the fold. The Financial Times put it next to a column that they'd titled The Substance Gap. Even Al Jazeera showed it. On adding a translation of Rubio's famous line, "The chair is empty." The questions are not. This wasn't because AOC had lost in any typical way, or because she'd been shamed, yelled at, or caught in some scandal, but simply because she'd been asked questions she just couldn't answer. And there, in the stark reality of Munich, that was all it took. She had arrived, hoping to try out for leadership of the free world. And the free world had, very politely, very quietly, and utterly devastatingly, I said no. That scheduling conflict? It wasn't actually real. Her team had already booked a flight for her back to New York for Friday evening, just 3 hours after the first panel wrapped up. Her communications director then spent those entire 3 hours on the phone with reporters, trying desperately to reframe how the day had gone. The Congresswoman successfully challenged the administration's approach to alliances. They'd say, her passion resonated with European progressives. This was all about starting a conversation. But here's the thing. Munich doesn't really care about passion. Munich doesn't give you extra credit just for starting conversations. Munich is the kind of place where you either genuinely know the answers or you simply don't. And that Friday afternoon, everyone in that room had watched the Congresswoman simply not know. The video clips spread online much quicker than anyone could have guessed. Where Venezuela is not below the equator was the very first one to hit. A clean, factual, and absolutely devastating moment. By Saturday night, it had racked up an astonishing 14 million views. This wasn't just because conservatives pushed it, even though they certainly did. It was because geography teachers were sharing it. It was because foreign policy students were sharing it. It was because it was that rare political clip that didn't need any partisan spin whatsoever. She said the words, and the words were incorrect. And that, right there, was the clip. The awkward silence about Taiwan came in second. Someone took those 30 seconds of and you know and edited it into a split screen right alongside Rubio's sharp reply. 23 million people are counting on us, and we do not say That version got 22 million views. A journalist in Taiwan even translated it and put it up on the island's biggest social media site. It ended up being the most shared video clip in Taiwan for that entire week. The bartender speech circulated a bit more slowly, which is typical for things that are profoundly true rather than just outrageous as they move across the internet. It was shared first by Cuban Americans, then more widely by other immigrant communities, and eventually by folks who'd never even heard of Marco Rubio, but recognized the familiar story of a father who just worked hard and never complained. It didn't explode like the geography clip had. Instead, it dug in deeper. Fox News played the highlights endlessly on repeat. Sean Hannity even broadcast the entire bartender section without any cuts and then remained silent for 8 full seconds afterward, which, for Hannity, was pretty much a standing ovation. Ben Shapiro declared it the most impactful diplomatic showing by a Secretary of State since James Baker himself. Laura Ingraham honed in on the Spanish-language aspect of the moment. She represents a 46% Latino district and can't answer a question in Spanish, she pointed out. He's the son of Cuban refugees and managed to conduct diplomacy in the very language of the hemisphere. CNN handled it with a little more caution, but not significantly so. Jake Tapper's headline bluntly stated, AOC struggles with foreign policy basics at Munich. Even MSNBC aired a segment provocatively titled, Did AOC's Munich trip backfire? A question that pretty much answered itself. And President Trump then weighed in on Truth Social at 11:42 p.m. on Saturday, proclaiming, AOC got destroyed by our great Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at Munich. He added, she doesn't know where Venezuela is, wants to be president, but can't find countries on a map. The bartender's son dominated America first. Vice President Vance, in a quick chat with reporters, called it embarrassing for her, for the Democrats, for anyone who thought she was ready for the world stage. Back in New York, AOC shared an Instagram story from JFK Airport. She wore sunglasses, no makeup, aiming for that casual vibe of someone trying to show this whole thing was no big deal. Went to Munich to sound the alarm about inequality and the collapse of the global order, she wrote. Just not to be quizzed on geography. The real story isn't a slip of the tongue. It's that the world is burning and the people in power are selling the fire extinguisher. The top comment, with 43,000 likes, simply asked, "Girl, do you know where Venezuela is yet?" Meanwhile, the Democratic establishment fell completely silent. And in the world of politics, that kind of quiet can often be the loudest message of all. Hakeem Jeffries? No statement from him. Chuck Schumer? Nothing. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus managed a single sentence, vaguely mentioning the importance of engaging in international dialogue. Governor Newsom, who had also been at Munich, said absolutely nothing. Governor Whitmer, who had attended the conference, also stayed silent. Mark Kelly, who had even spoken on a different panel, offered no comment either. Not a single prominent Democrat stepped forward to defend her performance. Not one person claimed she had done a good job. And nobody even bothered to attack Rubio, because the 2028 primary was already a looming presence in the room. And everyone who might potentially challenge AOC for the nomination understood one very clear truth. If she went down, they would rise. Trong mot kuok bao ku so botong thong, kong ko jong min, chi ko loi ik, na chien luok jang dan, chu hang shankov jatuyen, bo kong kai. Ong noi rang jola, mot kuok tisak jebje, ko ai de hien kanang kwamin, ve kats vanje kwakti. An hung ko ai jan de hien su thiu, sot huan tuan ve kats vanje kwakte. Ko ai chua san sang cho san kau kwakte. Ngay ke nam ngoi puno trong chuang trin the view. Nhong den ngoi bat jong ve moa tu. Kong jong I rang ko ai jan vap nangu. Ko ai jon gian la kong ko kach nao je fuk hoi. Moten ngoi dan chuang trin noi. He the view jong I rang banjan tua. Tradan banjan tua. Giam mach Robert Baron, kwa giao hoi kong giao jan, chitrich hunghan, kset kwa ko ai tai Munich, Vijautran giai kap nhu te jang noi, behetu tuong Marxist tren san kau tuan kau. Bin luan vien bao tu Victor Davis Hansen kon geigat hun. Ong noi ko ai kong biet, gi ve jai loan. Ko ai kong biet, gi ve lich su. Ko ai kong biet, ve chien tran triu tien. Ko ai kong biet, gi ve jiu jo. Ong so san kau tra loi kwa ko, ai ve jai luan voimot ko tra loi lan truyen, tu kwok ti sakjep nam hein hin kong tram le bay. Thit he jan gai ra cho ka hai jang. Mot ha chien luok jang dan chu o New York, nangoi jan lam viek trong chien, dich jau tien kwa ko ei. Noi voi politico, rang Munich lerala, hoi, jau cho kwok tro chuyen, nam haning hin kong tram hai moi tam. No ko de la dao cham het cho no. Ban ko de fuk hoi sao mot bai fat bio toy. Ban kong de fuk hoi sao ki kong biet Venezuela o jau ki ka de gioi jang theodoi. Yi bai fat bio taimet gala, luangan goi theo doi tren Instagram, nhang joan cliplan truyen, tukach fien ju tran kwa uiban. Kong ko ju nao trong so jo ko inkia, Tronkachkan fong noi tuong lai kwa nato jang juok kuyet jin. Munich jan gia ko ai dua trentio chuandui, hatma no kong han, noi dang, vathai ko ai trong rong. Batuan sao, mot kuok tham, do kwa quinipiak chotai su ungho, kwa ko ai trong so kachku tri, sobo jang dan chu tiem nang jan giam, muoi mot giem. Ko hoi jatra la, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez ko ju tukashlam tong thong kong. Nam moi ba fantram noi kong. Trong sokach kutri tran nam moi tuoi. Sao moi tam fantram noi kong. Chuyen ji Munich ja juokatiet ke je chung min ranko ai ja san sang. No jan chung min jiun guok lai. Rubio roi Munich vao chiu tubai. An ai ja hong tham du boi tiep tan be mak, an ai bei jen ankara jegap bo truong nguai giao, thon hiki ve viet tai jin kung guoi tinan Syria, bon gio jam fan ve so luong, utoi gian va hau kan bien gioi. Luai kong viek hong bao gio len Instagram va hong nen. Tren mai bai, troli qua an ai cho an aixem so luong clip, dong ve Venezuela. Muay bon trio, kau traloi ve jailoan, hai muay hai trio. Bai fat bio quan ngoi, fa he jang teng len. Tat noji, Rubio noi. Tom tat ve Erdogan lagi. Tuan gay, ngai jang thin han o muay hai kwak gia. Erdogan, lam on. Trole qua an ai jong mai tin sachte, vamos o tom tat vi, ton hiki vi jola su hachbiet. Ivano jala su hachbiet ngai tujau. AOC gen Munich vi mai an. Rubio gen Munich jelan viets. Va ki mai an tat, so ai bai ven ha jelen. Instagram va an ai bai gen Ankara. An ai goi janet tu mai bai. Nam foot thoi. Chach konten now. Me em de now. Concho lai gam mot chieks giai kach roi. An ai quoi, mot nu quoi that. Kio quoi chi swat hien kin guoi, o jau dai ben kia hiu ban huan toan. Munich the now. On. Em shem kach clip roi. An jan lam tot. On ko ai chua san sang. Jo hong fai la mot kwak chien kong bang. No ko nen hu vei kong. An ai jan ngi ve jiu jo. Hong hang an wak no jan hu vei. An ai thuk su muon noi jiu jo. Hong ko niem vui nau trong hong gi jan saira. Hui huai moten guai kong chuan bi kong fai lan guai giao. No gan giong nhu su thuang hei. Hong san ko jan joy hoi jiu jo. Va he muai ba trion guai o jai luan. Va ba trion guai ti nan Venezuela. Va tam tram trion guai chao. Au put huak vao lien min. Ti ho hong ko kei ksha chai le kem tai tik cho mot nu ngi si chua joki. Chakwa an ai si hiu. Mario Rubio jandan bon moi nam so kwe bar pukvu jo wang cho hung guai bietit hon an hiei. Ve hau het moi tu. Ve an ai chua bao gio kien hukam thai nhobe vi jiu jo. Nungong kung chua bao gio gia vorang kong biet kung giong hu biet. Marco ong e thung noi. O jat nuk nei. Kong ai quantam ban bat jau tu jau. Nong ho quantam niu ban kshuat hien san sang. Yu luon shuat hien san sang. Rubio mo so tomtat ve ton hiki. An ai ko mot kwok hop voi Erdogan trong chin gionua. Ko batrio ngoi tinan Syria. O ton hiki matuang laikwa hopu tuok vaon hung gi ksai ratrong kan pong jo. An ai bat jau jok. Tai Miami vao toi tu bay mot ko gai moi bay tuai goi trong fong gu kwa min o hialia va ksem kach clip tren mai tin kshach te. Tenko Ayla Sofia. Chame ko ai gentu Nicaragua vao nam hang hin kong tram le chin. Chako ai kwan li mot hako. Miko ai lam viek tai kway letan kwa mot fong kham hakoa. Ho jan jen voi heban tai trang va jan sai dang juok mot tu gijo. Va ho jan oi voi, Sofia moi, gai trong joy, rang jat nuok, jan cho fep, hok sai dung jio jok sung jang juok bao ve. Ko ai ksem Rubio noi ve chamin. Ko ai biet ngoi jan ong jo. Hong fai theo nghia jen. Nhung ko ai biet ong ai. Ong ai la chu kua ko ai. Ngoi laik se tai giao hang van ken hak Celia Cruz het ko. Ong ai la ong noi kua ko ai. Ngoi jang ko chavaon gai, ong etro than kong dan va mang theo giai chung, han trong vi cho jen gai ong ai kwa joy. Ong ai la tat ka nhung ngoi jan ong ma ko ai jan lon len kung. Nhung ngoi jan ong lam viek truok ki mat troi. Mok va kong fan nan, va biet chin, ksak kai giakwa, tu do vi ho jan trano. Ko aiksem AOC lung tung voi, kau hoi ve Venezuela. She felt something completely unexpected. It wasn't anger, or even satisfaction, but pure embarrassment. After all, AOC was Latina. A vocal would be enough to change the world. She'd truly believed that being young, brown, and vocal would be enough to change the world. Munich, however, taught her otherwise. That real change happened in rooms where people had truly done their reading. And that reading was tough, with absolutely no shortcuts. She gazed at the empty chair. She watched Rubio, calm, specific, and prepared. I answer questions by himself for an entire hour. This was the son of a bartender who had risen to become the world's most powerful diplomat. Not through some fleeting viral moment, but through 40 years of his father's sacrifice and 20 years of his own dedicated preparation. Once the clips finished, she closed her laptop, then opened her phone, but not to TikTok or Instagram. Instead, she looked up how to apply for the Foreign Service exam. She had no idea where it might lead her. So she didn't even know if she would pass. What she didn't know was that 10 years down the line, she would be standing in a room very much like that one in Munich, with a nameplate bearing her name and a briefing book she had thoroughly memorized. Because by then, she truly understood. Because Rubio, her father, and every single person who had arrived in America with nothing had taught her that those in such rooms had to be experts. She just knew she wanted to be in those rooms, and she knew she would do the reading before she acted.